All right, everyone. Good evening. Welcome back. I hope you've had a chance to do some readings, although we're probably just going to get through the third and fourth chapter today, more or less, with some outside intervention. So let me just review a little bit for those that it's been 2 weeks and those that might not have been on for the first two classes. So essentially, we're starting from the point of view that we have what we call the Torah. The Torah, for our purposes, is the 5 books of Moshe, the Chumash, what we call the written law, the Torah shebichtav. We have the Torah that is written down, and it contains, more or less, depending on who you follow, 613 biblical commandments. And the premise of the book, which is based on the idea that how do we take the written Torah, the Torah shebichtav, the 5 books of Moses, which really represents the will of God as he manifested to us, right? The Torah is the will of God that we are to follow the values, the ideals, and the practices that God wants us to follow. The problem is, from a practical point of view, from a point of view of actual application, the Torah is deficient. The Torah shebichtav is deficient. It doesn't really give us any of the necessary, or most of the necessary details to actually observe the Torah. The premise of Rabbi Nyworth in his book, which he calls the narrow halachic bridge, is that halacha. Now, when I say halacha, we're going to see in a moment, halacha is really the whole compendium of what we call Torah Shebal Peh, right? What we call the oral Torah, the oral transmission. The halacha, which is the sculpting and formulating of the oral tradition, basically is the bridge between the Torah Shebichtav, the 5 books of Moses, the will of God, and what he calls life. How do we live a life of Torah? We can't live a life of Torah simply by reading the Chumash, and we don't know what to do. We don't know how to practically apply it. That was our first discussion at the very beginning. And if you remember, we quoted Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz, who says that in essence, the oral law, the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral law, humanizes the values and ideals of the Torah, right? It basically makes it accessible and applicable as practical law and observance. Now, the next question was, what is oral law? What do we mean when we say Torah Sheba'al Peh? And what we said was, it's very stratified. There are layers of Torah Sheba'al Peh. And from what we would call from the very beginning, halacha Moshe Misinai, laws that were given orally by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. You know that Moshe spent 40 days and 40 nights on the mountain before he came down with the first set of luchot, the first set of tablets. But we also know he spent 3 times on the mountain to receive the second set, first to ask forgiveness after the sin of the golden calf, then another 40 nights in order to receive, when he received finally the second tablets, that he came down on Yom Kippur. So that's really 120 days that that Moshe spent with God, receiving an oral tradition together with the written Torah. So for example, one of the laws, and there are not that many that we call Torah, halacha Moshe Misinai, laws that were given directly to Moshe. One of them we mentioned was, what are totafot? We talk about putting totafot in the Shema between our eyes. What are those totafot? We know they're tefillin. But where did we learn that they're black boxes? They have to be made of hide. They have to be absolutely square. They have to contain certain sections of the Torah. That is considered halacha Moshe Misinai. Now, those laws that are considered halacha Moshe Misinai are considered oral, but they have the weight of Torah Shebichtav. They have the weight of biblical law, right? They have the weight of do not kill, right? You shall keep my Sabbath, which is another law that we don't know how to keep properly unless we have the oral tradition. So after Torah Halacha Moshe Sinai, laws that were given by God to Moshe at Mount Sinai. Now, Moshe then took whatever traditions he received from God, whatever laws, and in Pirkei Avot, what does it say? Moshe taught it to Joshua, to Yehoshua to the elders, etc., etc., etc. And that is recorded, that transmission, that Masorah is what is recorded in the Mishnah, right? How those were taught by the rabbis from generation to generation are recorded in the Mishnah, which is redacted by Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince. And then we have the Gemara that expounds on all the Mishnayot, because some of the Mishnayot just give, they're basically like class notes from lectures that were given by the rabbis. They don't, and they collect all the opinions, and there are multiple opinions in certain laws. And some of the opinions are, is this a biblical law? Is this a rabbinic law? And the Gemara tries to unify all those opinions and come up with a maskana, a ultimate conclusion as to who do we follow. And we also talked about, after that, we said there was what we called midrashe halacha, right? Halachic midrash, in which the rabbis, the same rabbis of the Mishnah, strove to identify law by looking at biblical texts, using what we call the 13 hermeneutic principles, although there are more than just those 13. That's Rabbi Yishmael. For example, kal v'chomer, if it's this, then it implies that. Logic, if I find the same word in two verses, I can learn from that. And we saw the law, and we saw an example of this when we were talking about the question about can I offer the Korban Pesach, the Paschal offering, if Passover, Erev Pesach falls on Shabbat? And we had the whole discussion at Hillel, right? Hillel, before he became the great Hillel, and Hillel and Shammai, right, was asked this question. He gave a number of sources based on biblical verses, and he came to the conclusion that yes, you can, by saying, well, if I can bring my daily sacrifices, which if I don't bring them as a lesser punishment than the Korban Pesach, if I don't bring it, it's kareh, I get excommunicated, then certainly if I can bring this one on Shabbat, then I certainly can bring the Korban Pesach on Shabbat. Now, if you recall, there was a different, that was in the Talmud Bavli, the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, there was a different ending to that. The people who asked the question, who had forgotten the law, would not follow Hillel until he said, and thus I learned from my teachers, Shemaiah and Avtalun. Until he said, I learned it from my teachers, they would not accept it as normative halacha. They would not accept it as the law. And from that, we learned that the idea that you can't just look at the biblical text and make up a halacha. You and I can't just look at the text and say, oh, I can make an argument and learn a new halacha, new law, right? There has to be a certain misorah. Okay, that's about where we got to in terms of development of oral law last week, 2 weeks ago, excuse me. So now I want to add, without going too much detail, two other ideas, they're parallel. What we call takanot and gezerah. Essentially, they're types of rabbinic decrees, or rabbinic laws. The difference between a takana, right, is a positive legislation, right? In other words, it's a practice instituted by the rabbis, not based directly on a biblical commandment. There's a rabbinic mitzvah. So, for example, there may be takanot that today we have to do X in order to protect a particular law, or a gezerah, for example, to protect some of the laws of Shabbat, right? The rabbis instituted rabbinic strictures, right, to protect us, like the laws of muktzah, like, I can't write on Shabbat. We all know that one of the 39 malachot is you can't write on Shabbat with a pen or a pencil or any other writing implement. But the rabbis were concerned you might forget that it's Shabbat, or you might forget that writing on Shabbat is prohibited. So the rabbi said, you know what? You can't handle a pen on Shabbat. Now that's a biblical law. Nowhere in the Torah to say, right, or do the rabbis, the religious rabbis, the right, you can't handle a pen. That's called muktzah. So those laws of muktzah were considered gezerot. They were laws to protect the biblical law. So now I'll give you another example. The next step is also takanot and gezerot have to do with not necessarily new law, but new information. I'll give you a classic example. The Torah says you're not allowed to cook on Shabbat. What's the definition of cooking? Definition of cooking on Shabbat is I take a raw food, a food that I cannot eat in its current state. I apply heat to it, right? I heat it with fire of some sort, and then it goes from a raw state to an edible state. That's cooking. Well, in about, I don't know, 40, 50, 60, 70, when microwave ovens became very common, the question was asked of Moshe Feinstein, amongst others, well, is a microwave isn't really heat. Microwave is microwaves, literally, that bombard the molecules, excite the molecules, and the molecules then generate heat, but it's not heat by fire, right? Fire was the primary in the biblical text. It's fire that determines cooking. Hot coals, or literally over a fire, that's what's considered cooking. What about microwaves? Microwaves not fire. It's energy, and it excites the molecules. So can I then maybe put my microwave on a timer for Shabbat, put a raw chicken in before Shabbat, or before I go to shul in the morning, throw a raw chicken in it, my timer's set, I come home, I got a fresh cooked chicken in my microwave. Is that permitted or not permitted? So there are different opinions about that kind of thing. But Moshe Feinstein said as follows. He said, the fact that fire is mentioned in the Torah is because that was how you cooked in those days. You didn't have alternate ways of cooking. However, the idea is not what the element of heat is, but the fact that you take something, apply heat to it, and change it from one state to the other. If they would have had microwaves in the desert, they would have used them in the desert because it may be more efficient than lighting a fire and putting it over a fire. So this is a takana or gezerah that is based on the fact that they're not changing a halacha, they're simply understanding that there's new information. By the way, this goes back to, if you recall, I think it was in the first or second class, we had the midrash of that God told Moshe when he was on the mountain, right? All of the future halachot. Now, does it mean that he taught him what was going to be? He said, no, he gave him all the information to be able to apply it, i.e. that cooking is heating, right? And if they find a different way to heat, Moshe would have had the capacity in his day to determine that microwaves is considered cooking. It just didn't exist in his day. Okay, so you with me so far? Okay, good. Now, as I mentioned, one of the critical links was that there has to be, though, a Mesorah, that we're building one thing on the other. Now, the other thing that we discussed, and you'll see how all this is going to fit together in ultimately today's class. So the other thing we talked about was the idea of machloket. That's what I'm going to focus on a lot today. The idea of two different opinions. So we saw, number one, we had the idea of divine truth versus halachic truth. So we had the story of the oven of Aknai, and it had to do with whether the oven was considered accessible, that's susceptible to impurity or not susceptible to impurity. We went through that. That's not really the main part. The main problem was that Rabbi Eliezer maintained very strongly that his opinion that it was susceptible to Tumah was was in fact true, and he brought miraculous proofs, one after the other, miraculous proofs, until a voice from heaven came down and said, he's true. He's got the correct answer. To which the other rabbis, the majority rabbis, said, Lo b'shamayim he. The Torah said it's not in heaven. In other words, once God gave the Torah to man, he empowered the leaders and the sages that will be in that day to decide what the practical halacha is. Now we're going back to this idea of biblical law, and now how do we apply it? And the application, one of the principles that comes out of this discussion is the idea that, that we no longer can rely on divine intervention. That is now in our hands to determine. One of the things they used was majority rule, right? We go after the road, we go after the majority. Okay, that's about where we got to last time. I want to come back to understand the idea of machloket. One of the things that Rabbi Nyworth does, and I want to take it one step further from what he does, is he wants to say that this concept, what does machloket mean? When I have an argument about something, I'm trying to define what the something is. So I'm trying to define the parameters, right? I have a difference of opinion. Is it a horse? Is it a mule? Is it permitted? Is it not permitted? Why is it maybe permitted? Why is it not? How do I define it? That aven achnan, is it considered pieces, in which case it's not susceptible to tumah, or is it because it's cemented in the middle, considered whole and susceptible to tumah? The machloket, the back and forth discussion, right? You almost might want to call it almost a form of scientific method if you want, that I'm trying to define. And the rabbis, if you've studied the Talmud, right, and they're bringing in sources, they're trying to find what is the principle, what is the basis for what I'm trying to get at. So in essence, it's a machloket, it's a dispute for the sake of defining, coming to some kind of unified conclusion. And maybe not unified. Okay, so I want to make that point first of all. So what Rabbi Nyworth, and I want to show you the source that I sent you from Rabbi Steinsaltz, shows how this idea of machloket in distinguishing something is part of the creative process. So I sent you the verses, 3 short verses, relatively short verses from the first chapter of Bereshit, right? God created heaven and earth, and he says as follows. Vayomer Elokim, God said, let there be firmament, let there be an expanse in the midst of the water that may divide water from water. We know that this was now the separation, these waters are of the upper world, the metaphysical world, and the physical world. God is now creating, is now separating, right? Heaven from earth, so to speak. I'm not talking about heaven in terms of the universe, the planets. I'm talking about Shemayim. So, all right, Vayas Elokim et harakia, and God took this firmament, these 2 waters, that's called firmament, and he divided it. Upper water, lower water. And the lower water, and it was so. And God called, right? God called the upper waters the heavens, Shemayim. So according to Rabbi Nyworth, this was the idea of that there was tension, there was machloket for the sake of creation. Now, if we look into some of the other sources, one of the things that comes out of this discussion is the very fact that there's something strange about this second day. It's the only day in the 6 days of creation that doesn't say Vayar Elokim ki tov, and God saw that it was good. Now, why? Why didn't it say it was good on the second day? It says it twice on the third day, by the way. Why not? Because the lower waters, which were now part of the physical world, according to Midrash, the lower waters, which became the physical world, was complaining to God that we're losing that connection to the spiritual world. You're separating now spiritual from physical, and there was a machloket about that. There was disagreement. And because there was disagreement, it's low tov. Or let's put it this way, he couldn't say it was all tov. In other words, what he wants to say is on the second day, there was potential for good and bad. Let's look at what Rabbi Steinsaltz says. You can read his commentary within the text I sent you, but if you look at the discussion, he says as follows. He says, only on the second day was good was absent from the discussion. Listen to what he says. Distinction and separation are essential for the existence of the universe. Right? This machloket he calls distinction and separation. The world is not fixed, unchanging, is not a fixed, unchanging reality. Right? The world isn't static. Rather, it constantly moves on a continuum between opposing poles. The second day, which all existence was divided, right, existed divided between the upper and the lower worlds, enabled movement in different directions, progress, and ultimately life. Although the concept of division already appeared on the first day, the second day added a more profound form of separation. So this is a very, very important idea. This idea that in the physical world, right, there is movement. It's not static. Let me suggest it as follows. Machloket brings discourse, right? The lower world, according to the Midrash, the lower world argued with God. It's not the only time, by the way. If you remember, the moon argued with God. How can there be two great lights in the heavens? And therefore, God said, "You're right. You'll be the lower light. You reflect the bigger light." We have all through creation this idea of discourse and dissatisfaction. It's in midrash after midrash in the creation story. But that discourse, that machloket, can lead to discovery and ultimately creativity. Now, where we see this as opposed to in the Shemayim, right? In the Shemayim, there's no discourse, there's no machloket, there's no discourse in the heaven. In fact, I've taught this many different times in teaching the Rambam, Maimonides, on the foundations of the Torah. He talks about the angelic world versus the physical world. What is the difference between angels and human beings? Angels are static. There are 10 different names for angels in the Tanakh. 10 different names for angels. Seraphim, Malachim, Elilim, all these different names. They each represent a different level of spiritual closeness to God. But every angel on that level is static. They don't become closer to God or they don't become less close to God. There's no discourse, there's no dissonance, right? It's absolute truth. And so when we talk about angels in the upper world, it's static. When we talk about the physical world, it's dynamic. The very fact that God calls something good means that it has the potential for bad, right? My standard discourse, use and abuse, sanctity, profaneness. And so man, by the way, therefore has it above the angels because man is not static. Man can go up and man can go down. Man can elevate himself, man can lower himself. But in that dynamic role is the potential for creativity, which is what God intended in the physical world, which God intended for man. But it only comes out of the tension of discourse, of machloket. Second example on a biblical level. And Rabbi Neuwirth points this out. What was the difference in the nature of man before and after the sin of Adam and Eve? What was the difference between man before and after original sin? So before original sin, what existed in the world, in the human mind, was a knowledge of true and false. Right? As the Torah says, it says, by the way, almost as it shifts into the sin of the eating of the fruit, it says, and the man and the woman were naked and they were not embarrassed. In other words, it was a statement of fact. They weren't wearing clothes. True, false. It was a very empirical existence. Man at the very beginning, Adam and Eve, had the potential to unlock all kinds of scientific formulas because it's all empirical. It's all experiment, true, false. But after the eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge and good and evil, suddenly there was a mixture of good and not good. There was relative morality. There was relativity. It wasn't all true or false. And so it was present, therefore, in every person, every object, were positive elements alongside the negative elements, says the Shem Yishmuel, quoted by Rabbi Neuwirth. In other words, we are now a mixture of that little angel and that little devil on our shoulder, pulling us in both directions. So a little bit of good, a little bit of bad. So, but in that conversation that one has every time one's making a moral choice, right kind of choice, do I listen to the angel? Do I listen to the devil? What's happening? There's machloket. But ultimately, man makes a decision based on the information, the input. So, and there's not just one answer to whatever question man is trying to struggle with. There can be multiple answers. For example, I was talking I was asking Steve this question, Steve Lesnick, who's here earlier this week. There are two types of COVID vaccines. There's a traditional vaccine, right? Like I believe the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, correct? It's not an mRNA. All right, well, there's two types of vaccine. The standard vaccine where you take the protein of the antigen, right? And you introduce it into the body, and the body forms a reaction to it that provides the immunity. Or you take some of that, you take some RNA material that causes your body to create that antigen that is going to then give you the immunity. Did I say that correctly? Okay. In other words, there's two ways to attack it. So is one right and one wrong? Is one better and not better? That's a machloket to this very day. So let me kind of bring this to a little finer point. So now, what does that have to do with our earlier conversation, if you recall, about, if you remember Hillel and we talked about the oven of Achnai. We said that Eliezer had absolute truth. He had divine truth. He had truth. What we said was, there's truth, and what did we learn was the other kind of side of truth? We talked about Shammai and Hillel. Shammai was like Eliezer. Shammai wanted absolute truth. Hillel wanted shalom. It's interesting. The word machloket is from what root word? Chelek, right? Chelek is a piece. Like machloket, there are different pieces. Peace is shalom. Shalom is peace from the word shalem, wholeness. You want to take the pieces and create something whole. If you can create something whole from that works all right, that's called shalom. That's peace. Now, here's a phrase that you're all familiar with from the liturgy. Amar Rabbi Chanina, Rabbi said in the name of Rabbi Chanina, Talmidei Chachamim Marbim Shalom Ba'olam. Right? Talmidei Chachamim bring what? Increased peace in the world, right? The sages who decide halacha bring peace into the world. How do we know that? Shene'emar, as it says, V'chol banayach limudei Hashem. All your children should be knowledgeable of God. V'rav shalom banayach. And if you have that knowledge, you bring shalom, you bring peace to your children. Al tikra banayach. Don't read the verse banayach, your children. Eller bonayach, your builders. Your builders. It's not a whole cloth. You have to build it. You have to construct it. You have to figure out how do the pieces go together. You have to make it fit. You have to take the chalakim, the pieces, and make them create, according to the plan, the whole. And then if you do that, right? Shalom Rav lo avei Toratecha ve'lo lo michshol. Peace to the lovers of Torah, and there is no stomach for them, right? Yehi shalom b'chelech v'shalom b'natayah, right? Let there be peace within your walls and prosperity in your palaces, right? L'man achai re'adaber shalom bach, right? And for the sake of your brothers and friends, I shall peace be to you, right? L'man beit Hashem Elokeinu avaksha tov lach, right? For the house of Hashem, your Lord, I will seek tov. I will seek good for you. What is tov? Tov is the end product of successful machloket, right? We said on the second day of creation, God did not say tov. But by the end of creation, what did God say? Vayar et kol asher asa. He saw everything that he created. V'hinei tov ma'od. And behold, it was good. Hashem oz le'amo yitain. May God give strength to his people. Hashem yivarech et amo b'shalom. God will strengthen his people with shalom. So now we have, this is perhaps the idea of what is in support of Hillel's approach, right? Shammai's approach, we discussed in the last class, was absolute truth, empirical truth. Hillel's approach was shalom. And how did he build shalom? Why do we say Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim? When it comes to Hillel and Shammai, we say both of them are the words of the living God. They both are correct. They are both paths. But why do we choose Hillel 99.9% of the time over Shammai when we're deciding halacha? Because his ultimate goal is shalom. And how does he build shalom? Hillel? First of all, by what we learned this last time, what does he do? He teaches not only the opinion, the school of Hillel not only taught the opinion of Hillel, they also taught the opinion of Shammai. Not only that, they taught the opinion of Shammai first, and then they taught their opinion. This idea of the machloket, not avoiding machloket, not saying there's only one opinion, there's more than one opinion. But for the sake of shalom, we have to, there's that tension, like there was at creation, to be able to take all the pieces and put it together and to come to a conclusion that is tov and that is shalom. And that is why, how did the Pirkei Avot kind of put their stamp on this idea? It said, right, every dispute that is for the sake of heaven will in the end endure. The first element, it has to be a dispute for the sake of heaven. And so what is the type of dispute that for the sake of heaven that will endure? A dispute like Hillel and Shammai. Why was that one that will endure? Because it was for the sake of heaven. In other words, there was an idea of wanting to get to a true but applicable halachic determination that the people would be able to engage and follow. Because oftentimes the problem with Shammai was, he may have been absolutely correct, but nobody would be able to follow his opinion. Most people would not be able to follow his opinion. It might be true, but it's going to create more dissent. The search to try to work together that Hillel did by teaching Shammai first, that is the Shem Shemayim. That is teaching L'Shem Shamayim. And you can't say that, certainly can't say that Shammai wasn't L'Shem Shamayim. He was going for the ultimate truth, right? What we would call the divine truth based on our terminology. And so together we see this idea that machloket doesn't necessarily mean that there's only one opinion that's correct. It's what opinion is going to be followed and be established and get the stamp of approval, right, by the as practical halacha. So I would actually like to suggest to tie the last two thoughts together. If you think about it, Shammai wanted to live in a world of pre-original sin. He lived in a halachic world where it was a matter of empirically looking at the halacha. True, false. Eliezer lived in the world of pre-original sin, where the world was a world of true, false. Some of us live in that world. Some of us can only live in that world, where it's true or false. If it's not true, it's false. If it's not false, it's true. And I can't deal with anything but that. That is the world, maybe as God first created it. Not sure if it's the world that God intended. Maybe it was. But that is the world of Shammai. That is the world of Rabbi Eliezer. However, the world of Shammai, the world of the Rabbanan that disagreed with Eliezer, was a post-original sin, right? It was a world in which there was relative tension, not so clear. The potential to do the right thing, potential to do the wrong thing. It could be this way, it could be that way. Now we've got to sit down with the pieces. We have to have machloket. We have to have machloket l'shem shamayim. We have to have a machloket, a discussion, in order to distinguish what is the law and how do we apply the law in this situation, in this time, and in this place. That's post-Adam and Eve sin reality that I believe that Shammai undertook. Hill, I'm sorry, Hill, excuse me. Very good. Hill undertook. Okay. So again, just to kind of summarize, Shammai and those that are from the school of Shammai, the world, as I understand, God wanted it to be, or wants it to be. Hillel, the world as it is. In fact, let me just give you a quick quote from Rabbi, page 45, if I'm not mistaken. Right, so he brings it back to this whole idea of Beit Shammai held that the reason for deciding in favor of the majority was because of the value of truth. Therefore, when the minority is sharper, there's no reason to favor the majority. For those who are wiser will better plumb the depths of truth. So if I'm smarter than you and I get to a better truth, then that should prevail. Beit Hillel believed that the foundation for favoring the majority was because of the value of peace. What can most of the people abide by? Or what do most of the opinions of the rabbis come to a conclusion? And therefore, one needs to look only at the number of sages and not at their intellectual level, since the mere attempt to evaluate the intellectual state of sages could cause more dispute. So he says. And again, so the idea of through machloket, one tries to seek unity, one tries to come to peace, to shleimut, the difference between truth and peace, the difference between man who is dynamic and angels who are static. These are kinds of the ideas that I want to put forth, because in those ideas, what we're talking about is there is a gray area, right? The world as we live in it is really a gray world. However, for the purpose of what this class is ultimately all about is, I just heard this tonight. I forgot what I was listening to on one of the news channels, whatever, that is not a good time for moderates in the world today. Being a moderate is very hard because everybody wants to be white or black. Everybody wants to be on one side or the other side. If it's not this, it's that. If it's not true, it's false. If it's not false, it's true, right? But the world as it is a world in which there is machloket. And the problem is, or the challenge is, how do we resolve dispute? How do we dissolve that to create shleimus, create peace and wholeness? Okay, we're going to come back to that. So the other piece that I wanted to do to cover was to begin the discussion about, so who has the authority to decide halacha? In other words, so you could say anybody, if you look at the sources, I'm not going to read the whole chapter to you, just a few passages maybe, is the idea that if you're knowledgeable of Torah, you get to make a claim to state your Torah, to state your opinion, to state your belief. But there are caveats. Caveats are, you are not allowed to disagree or to even teach a law in front of your teacher or in opposition to your own teacher. Well, how does that work? How can there be, there's the idea that we can never go against a previous generation's established gezerot and takanot. Or can we? When can we? How can we disagree? So one piece, which we already discussed, was the idea that if there's a new situation which has not yet been, to which the principles have not yet been applied, can I apply those principles and maybe come up with a different answer than what maybe my teacher, my Rabbi, might have come up with? And so part of what the rabbis put in place to maintain the integrity of Masorah and the integrity of a halachic process. We already said a halachic process is, right, you can look at a verse, you can darshan a verse, you can interpret a verse, is the idea that, first of all, the only individual who can decide any halacha, psak halacha, is somebody who has smicha. Now, smicha, the idea of what we call rabbinic ordination today, but smicha was very different back in the day. It could only be in Eretz Yisrael. It could only be the rabbis of certain stature who literally would place their hands upon the head of their students and give them smicha. Tell them that they are now ready and able. They have learned everything they can or what they need to know to themselves be decisives of Jewish law. So the first idea is you have to have ordination. So ordination changed after the first second Beit HaMikdash. So the whole history of smicha I'm not going to go into tonight. It's a lengthy discussion. But we have this idea of smicha, that not just anybody can decide Jewish law and be opposed to it. But there's another thing. You can't. So for example, I have smicha. It's called Yora smicha. Yora means you studied Yora Day. Yora Day is only one of the 4 sections of halacha that we have. So it's in areas of Shabbat and Kashrut in certain areas. So, but I have no expertise in court cases, in Choshen Mishpat. I have no expertise in Jewish law pertaining to torts and those kinds of claims and injury claims. But if you have Yadin smicha, which is the higher level smicha, then you have passed a certain level of proficiency in those areas. But even a rabbi who has smicha, if you will, if he is not proficient really in understanding all of the sources from the Torah, from the Chumash, through the Mishnah, through the Gemara, through all of the poskim, through all of the, Rishonim and Acharonim, the whole basic transmission on any particular topic, that person is really not a posek per se. We're going to come back to that. We're going to come back to the idea of what is the difference. There's another area of machloket. The community rabbi, the Rosh Yeshiva. That's going to get us closer to the end today and what we're going to set up for tomorrow. All right, but this idea that the authority to decide halacha is based on smicha, it's based on ordination, if you will, that you've met certain standards and proficiencies to be able to decide certain levels of Jewish law, and that you have to actually be proficient with those laws. Okay. Now, these are limitations and not barriers. number one. Okay, these are guide rails, if you will, because if without those guide rails, then we could just start, we could use logic to just decide all kinds of things, and you will see that some of that becomes historically very germane to the history of Jewish law, the different denominations within Judaism, and how they're applied. Okay. So the question then comes up, first of all, one of the things we have to explore a little deeper, and we won't be able to finish it tonight, is when can you, I don't want to say innovate, when can you change or apply something that was never applied before, or turn around and say, well, there is a minority opinion. Now, we don't follow the minority opinion, but in what situations might I be able to follow a minority opinion? Also, at what point can you say that, how can I change what was a previous generation's decision? So Rabbi Nyworth brings an interesting quote on page, go to page 117 if you have the book, 117, 118, 119, but he brings a quote from the Tosfot Rid. The Tosfot Rid was one of the Tosafists of the 9th, 10th, 11th century, who wrote, was quite knowledgeable. And he says, listen, if I did my due diligence and I decided that I didn't agree with even Yoshua ben Nun, the Talmud Muvhak, the special best student of Moshe, I would state my case and I would follow what I understand to be the correct opinion. So the question is, how can you claim to know more than Joshua? So he does the famous, he quotes a philosopher, doesn't name who the philosopher is, but he basically says, we are dwarfs astride the shoulders of giants. We master their wisdom and move beyond it. Page 118. It is due to their wisdom that we grow wise and are able to say all that we say. It is not because we are greater than they. In other words, it's no diss to the previous generations. It's the fact that they created a foundation, and I am on the shoulders of all that they have given us to be able to find this new side, new approach to what they have already taught. The other thing that he says is that Rabbi Nyworth says, he quotes another sage, is that, and this is, I think, very true in the world of science as well. The idea that, for example, the Rambam was considered a Renaissance man. He pretty much knew everything about everything in a lot of fields. Why? Because it wasn't so hard to know everything about everything back then. It wasn't easy. It wasn't easy to be the Rambam. He was brilliant, right? But he understood philosophy, he understood medicine, he knew all of Torah, he understood halakha. He could write about philosophy, could write about all those things. But there wasn't an age of knowledge, of specialization, right? What they knew about the human body then is nothing compared to what we know about the human body today, right? And the specialization today, a cardiologist knows the heart, a nephrologist knows the kidney, but I wouldn't ask a nephrologist to give me advice on my heart condition and vice versa. So the idea that because of the proliferation of both all the various material that was transmitted over the generations and new information about science, horticulture, whatever it may happen to be, philosophy, that there was more at the fingertips of later generations, even into our generation, than there was in previous generations. So it's not that we are changing or going against, we are adding to, another facet of adding to what they have taught us and given us. Okay. So this brings us to the next point that I want to delve into. I'm kind of starting to pave the way for our next class. which is, for example, I just want to give you one example, another example of when we can look at halacha that we wouldn't ordinarily look at as normative halacha. So I'll give you an example from just last week. Those are said doing Mishnah Yomi. We did the last Mishnah in Bracha. The very end of the last Mishnah in Bracha says, "V'amar al tovos ki zanka emecha." Right? Don't despise your mother when she is old. Right? Don't dish your mother. Now here, mother is Torah imecha. Don't despise the Torah because you want to say it's antiquated. Right? The Torah is antiquated. It doesn't deal with my reality today. So the Mishnah goes on to say, V'omer eight lasot. So by the way, this is all talking about when we can quote God's name and we greet people with shalom. V'omer eight lasot Lashem heiferu Toratecha is a time to work for the Lord. They made void your Torah. So this is talking about Eliyahu, the prophet Elijah, when the priests of Baal were having a tremendous, it was an avodah zarah, it was a pagan practice that was taking over large numbers of the Jews. And so there was this confrontation, famous confrontation at Mount Carmel, right? Where Eliyahu said, you build an altar, I'll build an altar. He doused it with water, and he says, whichever altar God comes down and consumes on that altar, that will prove that my God, your God, which God is correct. Of course, we all know that the fire comes down and consumes the altar of Elijah. And what is the response of the people? Anybody know? Hashem hu Elokim, which is famous for, we say it 7 times, right at the end of Yom Kippur. Hashem hu Elokim, Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. It was a problem. It was a big problem, though, that the rabbis discussed. At that time, there was a law. The law was, once we had the Beit HaMikdash, you were not allowed to bring a sacrifice outside of the Beit HaMikdash, outside of the Temple Mount. It was forbidden. How could Eliyahu build an altar, bring a sacrifice outside the confines of the temple? So it says, Eight lasot Lashem. It was, in other words, it was emergency powers. It was a shadachat. It was an emergency situation. Why? Because heiferu Toratecha, they were despising the Torah, right? They were making void the Torah. So then the Mishnah ends, Rabbi Natan Omer says, heiferu Toratecha eight lasot Lashem. Because they were despising and making the Torah weak, that made it a time an essential time where emergency powers were available. Now, that was in the Bible. That was in Nevi'im, right, in Tanakh. But we had something like that during the Corona, right? Everybody remember the first Pesach, right at the very beginning, right? All the poskim, right? We're saying, well, ordinarily we don't allow this, but for this Pesach, we'll allow it. Ordinarily, we don't allow that because everybody who pays money and goes away for Pesach couldn't go away and had to make for the first time in their lives Passover, right? So there are all these leniencies that never would have been applied. By the way, one of the things that this year we learned was putting those leniencies back in the box and telling people, no, you can't do it this year, and you won't be able to do it again, God willing, next year, is very hard to convince people. In other words, sometimes the situationally, there is an eight lasot Lashem. Now I want to bring that to kind of where we sit today. I want to bring 2 things together. There is, based on what we've kind of been discussing, the idea of the Word of God, truth, and shalom, what the people need, what the people can abide by, right? That's kind of been a principle we're talking about. So the rabbis discuss Moshe, the leadership of Moshe, and the leadership of Yehoshua much in that same vein, the leadership of Moses and Joshua. Let me explain. Moshe was the lawgiver. Moshe sat down, taught them the black and white law. When they didn't know a law, they came to Moshe. Moshe would tell them, this is it. This is what God said. Or he'd go back to God and say, what do we do in this situation? We see it at least 3 times in the Chumash, right? Where he didn't know the law, he goes and asks God, the dies of Slachad, Pesach Sheni, the second Pesach with people, etc., etc. Okay, so Moshe represented that divine truth. That was Moshe. He was the one who received it directly from God. He wrote the Chumash, written law, divine truth, absolutes. And what happened? What happened at Mei Merivah? What happened at the waters of Merivah at the end of the 40 years in the desert when the Jews there was no water to be found? Miriam had passed away. The miraculous well wasn't with them anymore. They had no water. God said, speak to the rock. He struck the rock. He said, listen now, you rebels, which the Rambam says was his sin. What happened? What's the outcome of that? God says, you know what, Moshe? Time for a new leader. Who is the leader? Joshua. What was the defining definition of Joshua or attribute of Joshua that we read there? Someone that Elokei Haruchot, right? The Spirit of God is in him, and somebody who understands Ruach Kol Basar, Kol Bnei Adam. He understands the nature of all people. In other words, Moshe looked at it from an absolute, and he didn't understand what the people were going through, right? That was his sin. He was out of touch. Whereas Yehoshua, he was a Talmud Muvhar. He knew the Torah of Moshe cold. He was the one that Moshe directly taught it to him, in front of the elders. Joshua, maybe this much less than Moshe, knew everything that Moshe knew. But he was a person who understands the spirit of all men. He was able to relate to everybody. And so he was the one, right, that then needed to lead the Jewish people into the land of Israel, into practical living and application of all the commandments. If you remember, most of the commandments they didn't observe in the desert, many of them. Only when they entered the land of Israel, they now have to fully function. So is a dichotomy, that same dichotomy. Moshe, Yehoshua. Now, it's not all Moshe, it's not all Yehoshua. It's not all truth, and it's not all shalom, right? It's machloket. It's the strain and tension between the two that creates the creativity of halachic man, as Rabbi Soloveitchik would say, that gives us how do we decide the practical halacha. It's the Masorah. It's building on the foundation. It's knowing, sensing what is emergent, what is new, what did we not know that we know now, and how does it apply? Does it apply? Should it apply? Is this special circumstances? Is this normative now? Can we discard past practices, or do we have to maintain past practices and add on to it takanot and gezerot? Right? That's where this all funnels down to. Now, that same dichotomy in terms of practical halacha today. And you can look at it, there's different forms of it. It's Israel versus the diaspora versus North America, for example, may be slightly different. 50 years ago from today might be slightly different. But here's another tension. The tension between what we'll call the community rabbi and the Rosh Yeshiva. And there is what to balance on both sides. The Rosh Yeshiva, the posek, who lives in the walls of the Beit Midrash primarily, is an expert on Jewish law, is an expert on normative Jewish law. But he may be somewhat removed from practical situations. The community Rav, so he's much more, the Rosh Yeshiva looks at the halacha, he's asked a question, he looks at it from a completely objective, I should say complete, that's not true, from a relatively objective point of view. relatively speaking. I mean, a good posek definitely knows the subjective facts. But in other words, his approach to the halakha is one of a much more objective point of view. The community Rav, Lord Da'atra, Rabbi, right, is much more subjective. He's answering questions for his community, right, with whom he has a much more intimate relationship and knows much more about certain subjective facts. Now, it doesn't mean that you can just willy-nilly decide a halakha. But what it means is there's always been this tension. So there are some opinions that say the community, again, this is assuming the following assumption. They're both equally capable of answering the question, right? I will confess to many questions that I don't feel capable of answering on my own, that I have to ask a posek. But in that conversation, I'm able to introduce to him, right, all of that subjective knowledge that I have about a particular situation. And that is very important information. But in the areas where the community rabbi has that expertise, it's very interesting. There are two opinions. There's a one opinion, the local rabbi should never decide those types of questions. He should always go to a posek. Why? Because that very subjective knowledge biases him. The other opinion is just the opposite. Only the rabbi knows and can understand and has the sensitivity to understand that the halacha needs to be applied absolutely, but appropriately to the needs of individuals or to his community. So what has happened today, very interesting, what you'll find is orthodoxy today, I'll take even modern orthodoxy, what I'll consider the parameters of modern orthodoxy. I have to sum up. The parameters of modern orthodoxy today, I think, fall into three categories. On the one hand, and it's because of, and here I'll bring in for the first time kind of the postmodern world into this. The postmodern world is a world that says, I know my objective truth. And my objective truth doesn't really have anything to do with your truth. It has to do with who I am, and you have to accept my truth as much as I have to accept your truth. And into that world comes some realities. For example, things that we struggle with, just to throw out one or two. LGBTQ issues amongst observant Jews who want to be observant. Where do they fit into the modern Orthodox world? Now, as an example, and I could probably, maybe abortion might be another one today, okay? So what has happened is, because of, these are questions that are very difficult to deal with today. So what has happened is the modern Orthodox world has gone in three different directions. One part of modern Orthodoxy has said, I can't and I don't want to deal with these issues. Either they run too close to the fire, so to speak. They're too difficult. So you know what I'm going to do? My modern Orthodox world is going to be much more insular, much more Haredi-like, and I'm going to lean more towards the Rosh Yeshiva approach, the Das Torah approach, right? Rabbi, tell me what I should do. I can't really make a decision on my own. So we have communities like that. If you go to Teaneck, New Jersey, when I was youth director there were 3 shuls, and I think all the rabbis taught in yeshiva. But if you go now, there's many more shuls, and I can tell you that every single rabbi in those shuls, half of them are actually Rosh Yeshiva at YU and elsewhere, or of high schools. In other words, they have chosen kind of the Rosh Yeshiva model, right? Where give me the truth, tell me what I should do. Then you have on the other extreme, kind of the postmodern world that's saying, you need to deal with us. You need to expand the parameters of the halakha to be more inclusive, to take into consideration more of where humanity is at today. I'll put those as, and then you'll find what I would consider to be most modern Orthodox communities that are in that gray. Fealty to halacha, if you recall, that thing that I had, a fealty to halacha, but how do I create a world that is expansive and as inclusive as halacha can be? So that's the next part that we're going to attempt to look at, is what I want to talk a little bit more about, what I would call halachic malleability, right? How malleable can the halacha be in a postmodern world? And what are some of the critical issues facing the postmodern world? So I want to get to that. You should continue to obviously read, how, to the extent that we need to obey, the rabbinic authority is an important discussion for us to have. And also to try to figure out now, so where do we fit in? And I'm willing to bet that within every congregation, including our own, there are people who line up on all three of these cornerstones, if you will, of I don't want to deal with it, just tell me what to do, give me the halacha, to let's make the halacha more malleable and, somewhere in the middle. All right, thank you all very much. Rabbi Newman needs to start his class shortly. I thank you all for being here. I did record it. Now I just got to get it back from the cloud for those that want to review it or after and able to be with us. Okay, hold on 1 second. Okay. All right. Well, we can maybe discuss it more at the beginning of the next class. Okay, Miriam, I'll try to take a look at that and from that perspective. Thank you. All right, everyone. Have a good evening. If I don't see you before, have a Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Where's the other